I'm here at the Commonwealth Secretariat in London, where renowned economist Professor Joseph Stiglitz has presented a report on Aid for Trade. Aid for Trade comprises financial and technical assistance that are provided to developing countries to help promote their supply-side capacity and participate more effectively in global trade. Professor Stiglitz's report focused on three key topics: the history of Aid for Trade in context, the extent of the success, and two proposals to ensure that international trade works for poor countries. Some criticisms of the report were, however, eminent, as this delegate told me.
It's a report we welcome. Clearly, it's an important issue. It's an issue that speaks very directly to the concerns of an organisation like UNCTAD, where I work, and it is making proposals to give UNCTAD a much more prominent role in the Aid for Trade debate, which is something we think is also appropriate, needless to say. I think in terms of the details of the Stiglitz proposal, there is still work to be done, both in terms of the right to trade and the proposal of a global trade facility, but they're both moving in the right direction.
The roundtable conference organized by the Commonwealth Secretariat as part of its program on international trade, which became priority after the subject of Aid for Trade was formally discussed by the World Trade Organization members at their Hong Kong Ministerial Conference in 2005. I asked the Director of Economic Affairs Division at the Commonwealth Secretariat what the report presents, and also spoke to the permanent representative of Lesotho in Geneva at the conference.
In the report, we asked for a review from Professor Stiglitz and Dr. Charlton of progress with Aid for Trade. And what we find is that there have been a number of quite useful advantages from the process thus far. The amount of resource going to Aid for Trade has increased in the last few years. That's been positive. What we're not sure about is whether this has displaced resources which are coming from other sources, which might have gone, for example, to other forms of aid. We're not clear about that, but clearly the evidence shows that there's been an increase. It also shows that the costs of doing trade in developing countries through Aid for Trade has actually reduced. And we, in the Commonwealth Secretariat, have prepared some research material which shows some of the figures underlying that judgment, that Aid for Trade helps bring down the costs of trade.
Well, I think it's work in progress. There are some interesting proposals that have been made. Some can be applied, as may be very difficult to apply. So I think there is still more work to be done on the report.
Nonetheless, behind the Aid for Trade movement, there has been recognition that trade liberalization by itself is not sufficient condition for an increase in trade or economic development. Professor Stiglitz says there is considerable promise in Aid for Trade, but so far it has not delivered.
There were two ideas that we put forward beyond the broad proposal of strengthening Aid for Trade. Thrust of the report is Aid for Trade is really important, has not been as additional as one would have hoped, not been as effective as one would have hoped.
Aid for Trade is just another form of conditionality which may actually impair the effectiveness of assistance programs, according to Professor Stiglitz, adding that Aid for Trade has become a substitute for meaningful reform of global trading system.